So can everybody hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. Can everybody see me okay?
Yep.
All right. I guess then nothing less to do but proceed. So today I'm going to review one of Elder Tess's studies. It's not the complete study, but you can see on the board I've written what the title of her study was: Contraception, Abortion, and the Supreme Court. And it was done on July 1st, 2021. So this subject is not going away, and we still see it in the news quite a bit in one form or another. And I thought, we would review it. So if people want to chime in. If you have questions, I could try to answer them. But I will ask a couple of questions, and let's start with the first question. So who wants to chime in with this? January 22nd of this year was a big anniversary, let's just say, for something that us as radical feminists should be aware of. And I wasn't really aware of it until it started hitting the news a little bit. So does anybody know what happened on January 22nd? It's an anniversary, let's just put it that way.
Roe v. Wade?
Yes, okay. Thank you for that, Linda. So that was like 51 years ago. And I just thought it would be appropriate for now. So radical feminism has two principles that line up with our message. And those two principles are as follows, and we all know this: the personal is political, and the second one is sexism is the deepest, the worst, the oldest foundational form of discrimination. So her study had other things, as always, in it, like reviews and stuff like that, but I really am just going to focus on the contraception, abortion, and Supreme Court end of it. So this is where she kind of dives off into this subject. And she makes a statement now that it didn't hit me at first, but then it hit me because there's been a lot of questions in the movement over the years, let's just say, about how to sift, or she puts it sorting in this this presentation. And in one sentence, she gives us like the universe on what to do. And this sentence is, she says, if these, and that's the two principles that line up with our message: the personal is political, it's the deepest, the worst, the oldest foundational form of discrimination. If these were believed and lived out, we would have no problem sorting or sifting through external information. I thought, wow, that's really a nice guideline for me. I mean, I didn't really have a good handle on sifting. And so it was always helpful when people would ask the question. I would try and learn a little bit more about what to sift. I generally was thinking about, the two sides of information, the two streams of information. And that was kind of how I was using as a yardstick on sifting or sorting through external information. But this right here, talking about basically feminism and sexism and really patriarchy and all, that is what really helps us or guides us when we go down that line of trying to see if the information we're reading is, something that is aligning with our message, our movement. Okay, so that being said, I really like this verse, and I'm not going to quote you the verse, I'm going to do what we've been told to do, is put it in our own words. And that verse is 2 Peter 1:12. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this information should be pretty familiar with everybody that's listening to me. I mean, there might be a few things that maybe we didn't know. I mean, I learned some things also when I was going through this study. But 2 Peter 1:12 tells us that he'd like to remind us. Peter would like to remind the people of things that they already know. So I used to have a teacher when I was going through respiratory school that would repeat over and over. He said that repetition was the mother of study. So repeating is not a bad thing. And Peter tells us that we should repeat. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 first wave feminism women. And the first one is Margaret Sanger. She should be a familiar name. Oops. Margaret Sanger. Okay, who's Margaret Sanger? Does anybody want to volunteer who she actually is? Or was, I should say?
She helped develop the birth control pill.
Yes. One of her major contributions to society and actually the world when you think about it. So she's born in 1879 and she dies in 1966. And so she dies at the ripe old age of 87 years old and contributed much to the American birth control activism she was involved with. She was a sex educator, she was an author, and she was a nurse. And not all of those things are in order of how she did things in her life. But I was interested to know, okay, what was she the author of? I mean, I didn't really have any idea. Well, it turns out she wrote columns in a magazine or a daily newspaper in New York called the New York Call. And in 1911 to 1912, she wrote a series of articles that was entitled What Every Mother Should Know. And so you could see she's an educator right there, along with an author. And then in 1912 to 1913, she writes more series of columns, and they're entitled What Every Girl Should Know. So she's really trying to educate back then what's going on. And still, we're living under the time period then that was the Comstock laws. And so she's bucking the system, just even writing these articles. So she also was known for, I found this out, for the term that was coined, and she coined it in 1914, and that was birth control. And we always think that that was around forever, but somebody had to coin it at some point, but Margaret did. So she coins the phrase birth control. And that sets us on a path down here. So in October of 1916, she opens the first birth control clinic in the United States. And then later she gets involved in Planned Parenthood, the evolution to bring about Planned Parenthood. And her history was, we should know that her mother had a pretty rough life, let's just say. She went through 18 pregnancies in 22 years. And Margaret was the 6th of 11 children. So she was around with 5 other more children being born by her mother. So her mother dies at a relatively young age. And the literature says that she died of actually tuberculosis, or they called it, what they call back then, consumption. And so at 50 years old, she's dead. And then I found this other account where I believe this sets Margaret on a path to her activism, but she says that article says that one account said that she confronted her father at her mother's gravesite and told him that it was his fault that her mother was dead. I thought that was pretty amazing. She would really have the gumption to go and say something like that, at a gravesite. But this is how she was. She was a person who spoke her mind, and she had a passion for life, and not just, the pre-life in the womb, but passion for those that are actually living. So later, soon after that, she goes off, leaves home, and I'm not sure exactly when it was that she went into nursing and went to nursing school and went into nursing. So in 1913, Margaret, she worked in the Lower East Side of New York, taking care of poor women that were suffering greatly from frequent childbirths and self-induced abortions. At that time, it was reported that you could obtain a $5 back alley abortion there in New York. I don't know where else, but that's just what the literature is saying. And of course, you can guess that not all those went well. So there was a lot of tragic experiences in this time of really darkness. It's a time where persecution is rapid and women's rights are nil. So then after one tragic case, she decides to dedicate herself to helping American women gain the knowledge of birth control. So she has this passion that she's going to help people, right? All right, so that's Margaret Sanger. And next we want to look at briefly is Catherine McCormick. Okay, so who's Catherine McCormick now? Does anybody know besides Linda?
No, I do not remember her.
Okay, well, she is, go ahead.
She's a widow
Yes,
that
she is a
helped-
widow.
that donated Margaret Sanger to produce the birth control pills.
Yes, you're right. So she was an American suffragette, which I had kind of forgotten. And she was very involved in that. She was, I read somewhere, I think she did some book work or was a secretary. I don't remember what it was, but she was really involved in it. She just wasn't one that was out there carrying signs around. So she was an American suffragette. She was a philanthropist and was one of the very first women, I had no idea of this, one of the very first women to graduate from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And there she earned her degree in biology. And this was in 1904. So she was very well educated. And that's where she did meet her husband, who later died early, actually. So after her husband's death, his name was Stanley McCormick, and he was the youngest son of Cyrus McCormick. So after his death, she inherits a large sum of money, as we heard. And so who's Cyrus McCormick? Have anybody ever heard of that? I knew that name, and I couldn't quite picture it because all I could think of was the McCormick, what do you call it? Spice?
Is it the spices? Yeah, the seasoning
Yeah.
spices.
That's what I was thinking. Well, this is way different from that. I'm not sure if that is actually, what's Kathy saying? Oh, Kathy knows the answer. Okay, so he is the founder of the International Harvester Company, and I've heard of that. I've heard it was like farming equipment, stuff like that. Well, actually, he was the inventor of the mechanical reaper, which was a game changer for harvesting grain and such. So this company becomes, world renowned and well known and makes tons of money. And so, being the son of Cyrus McCormick Stanley, he's well off, and they do actually, I think, meet in college, and I forget what he was majoring in, but but they meet there. So Margaret Sanger and Kathy McCormick, they team up and they work towards birth control. And like I said, in 1916, Margaret opens up her first birth control clinic in the United States. And it's not an abortion clinic, it's only a birth control clinic. And what happens there is immediately the authorities, the police, come in and shut it down. And they throw her in jail for 30 days. Well, I find out that this was not the first time or the last time that she's thrown in jail. She's thrown in jail, I found, a total of 8 different times because of her work, basically. So, she has a passion to do what she wants to do. She's a very willful lady, and thank God for that. So she is thrown in jail for 30 days. They shut her down. And why are they shutting her down? Well, it's on the count of what was back then called the Comstock Act or Comstock Laws. Comstock Laws, okay? So they're pretty oppressive laws back then, and it seemed like everybody went along with it. That was just the culture, let's just say, back then, that people would be following along with whatever the laws were saying, okay? And we're going to go into a couple of those instances in a little bit here. But at this time, after she's thrown in jail, and because of the Comstock Laws, and the Comstock Laws were basically just prohibiting the distribution and of information and the devices for birth control. That's all it was. And we can see right now that, those laws were pretty much done away with, but we can see right now that they're kind of being revived in the sense that maybe just the spirit of them, but when you see certain states prohibiting the receiving of contraceptions, and the pill is one of the biggest, not contraceptive, biggest birth control, abortion pills to people that can't get them in their state, so they're using the mail to do it. And since they're trying to find ways to prohibit this, make it illegal, this is just really more flavors of Comstock Laws coming back here, in the next century.
Hey, David.
Okay. Yes.
Comstock Laws was enacted, 151 years ago?
Yeah, very long time ago. So think about that mentality and what's trying to be brought back right now. It's off the charts, really, as far as making progress in women's rights, really.
Yeah, but the point is 151.
Okay, I take that. Good. I like that. Thank you. Let me see. Okay, so at about this time that she's getting out of jail, let's say 30 days later, there's soldiers that are coming back from World War I, and they're bringing little presents home, and these presents are sexually transmitted diseases. So the government says, oh, since it's the men, we better do something about it. And that's just was the patriarchy and the sexism that was alive and well back then, and mostly alive and well today. So at that time, because things were loosening up a little bit, it loosened things up for Margaret Sanger and Catherine McCormick to get things done in this developing more birth control. and having less chance or being less danger of being arrested. Okay, so going on to more of Catherine McCormick, she travels to Europe, and she travels over there on a mission. She's not going over there to drink wine in France, because that's where she goes. And she goes over there and she pretends like she's a scientist and she's studying birth control and diaphragms. And so she orders them in bulk. And then consequently, she has a plan. So she sews these into garments and then has them packed up and shipped back to the United States illegally. So she really is standing on what she believes, and she's going to get these things back in one way or another because it's going to help a lot of people. So, interesting enough, I was reading more about her and the smuggling of these things, and it pops up in, because earlier I'd shown that, or told you that she went to MIT. Well, with her money, she ends up building a hall, which is really a residential building for women at MIT, because they didn't really have it and women weren't really attending MIT, just a few. And so she wanted to make a way for more women to be admitted and be able to go through the college. So she donates the money and has this McCormick Hall built. And I don't know exactly what year that was, but anyways, it's built. Okay, so this hall is to help solidify the MIT's commitment to equal education of women. And ever since that time, then the number of women who were attending steadily, began attending steadily, it grew and grew and grew until I don't remember what the percentage was, but it was like 47% or something like that. Women were going. Okay, so back to the smuggling story here. So she gets this thing smuggled in, right? And then as I read this article, I realized that it's saying that there was some trunks, and these are the very trunks that smuggled in all of these garments, were ending up in the hall at McCormick Hall in MIT. So she saved these as like relics of, this is where we were. And ladies, you need to understand that there's a fight, there's a battle going on, and I want these in this hall to demonstrate that this is a hard fought battle. Okay, so, and it works because people begin to see that women that can be educated. The first one, that when they first started out and allowed a woman to go in there, they didn't even put her name on the roll there at MIT because they thought she would flunk out, and they didn't want to be embarrassed by someone flunking out of their school. It was just a hard fought battle. So going back to Margaret Sanger, another little fact I realized, that she wasn't the only one involved in fighting for the diaphragms, let's say, being brought in. I know that was Catherine McCormick, but Margaret Sanger's husband, he works in the publishing business. And in the publishing business, he has opportunity to order supplies. And so he orders supplies that were put in these barrels or drums, and they were marked rubber goods, and some were marked chemical supplies. Well, guess what? These are diaphragms that Noah Schlee, Margaret Sanger's second husband, has smuggled in. So it's coming in more than just a few trunks, helping women. Okay, so we realized that Catherine McCormick, she donates over $2 million, which is a whole lot more now, to help develop the first oral contraceptive. And this money is the money that funded the work on the pill. So these two women basically are known as the mother of the pill. And it's funny, it's always the pill. Okay. So now you know who the mother of the pill is. The mothers. Let's see. So they insisted, these two women, that that the pill be a precondition for the emancipation of women. And, you know, we've been shown that when you look at the fight for civil rights, you can kind of marry that to, or use that as an analogy to the fight of women. And so we know that there was the Emancipation Proclamation, but there was never Emancipation Proclamation for women. And, you know, that's kind of a black eye for our country, really. But contraception was a precondition for this emancipation. So these two women helped in the work of making second wave feminism, emancipation, possible for women. Okay, and they're again fighting Comstock laws. And so we'll briefly tell you a couple of those. First of all, you could be punished, and if you found guilty of breaking one of these laws, and you could be put into hard labor for up to 5 years. Yeah, 5 years hard labor. And it was a crime in 23 states to just advertise contraceptive information. In 14 states, it was a crime to tell anyone where contraceptive knowledge could be found. You know, so there was really, and I had a little debate with ChatGPT about this, you know, because we were talking about free speech, and I said, well, where was the free speech, you know, back then for them? And so Chat defended the idea that, well, you know, it just wasn't the time yet. You know, he didn't want to go into, or he or she, whoever ChatGPT is, didn't want to go into the fact that this was flat out, you know, basically against the Constitution. There was supposed to be free speech. And I was learning through this that ChatGPT doesn't know everything. They didn't even know how to spell Catherine McCormick's name. They spelled it with a C, among other things. And so I educated him, and they thanked me for educating him. Just a side story. Okay, so these are just two examples of some of the Comstock laws. And then mercifully, in the first half of the 20th century, most of these laws were ruled unconstitutional. So in 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut, that Supreme Court case made it legal for married couples to buy and use contraception. And this was a stake in the heart of Comstock laws. So in the decision to strike down Roe v. Wade, those dissenting said the right to an abortion arose out of the right to use contraception. They're linked together. So we know there's always been a plan A, so there's always been a plan B to follow that up. So when plan A fails, which would be contraceptive, then plan B has to be brought in. And that was the abortion right. So when it comes to discussing the topic here of abortion, it's rooted really deeply in emotion. You can see on both sides of the argument how people get heated up real quick when it comes to this subject. But it's a psychological and often religious-based emotion. And when you get religion and emotions going together, you get, you know, all kinds of problems. Okay, so the sanctity of life comes out of Catholicism, and it's taught that sperm is holy. This is thought to be right out of Aristotle's playbook, and their cultural arguments expressed in religion. So I was trying to verify this stuff about Aristotle, and I was having difficulty. There's a lot of stuff to try to weed through. And I found this interesting fact that him, and back then at that time, they believed that all pregnancies, the baby growing in the womb, were males. And the only way you would ever get a female, this is what they believed, was if something went wrong in the womb, and then a female would be born. So I was like, well, what kind of logic is that? You have to have male and female, and something going wrong, you're depending on something going wrong so that you can have male and female. It was just really odd. But this is a long time ago. They didn't have the science we have, and so they had a lot of superstition and made up stories is basically what it was. So under universal rights, you can't be strapped down and have your kidneys or anything removed, body parts removed. But in the case of women, the reproductive health, it's all wrapped up in religion suddenly, and it's embedded in culture, and it's all highly emotional. So it's a double standard, you might say, women being left out. Okay, when the sanctity of life is brought up, it's really about the role of women in society and the family. And I thought, well, that's an interesting statement. And then when you think about it, it's so true, right? Because who's running things is patriarchy's running things, right? So when you start talking about this sanctity of life, they're going to throw, their beliefs about patriarchy in there, and where society tells the women that they have to stay, and what role they're going to play in the family. And so in the work of emancipation, contraception is vitally important. If you don't have contraception, the women just can't control their own lives and what direction they're going to go into. So it's really the bedrock of emancipation, contraception. Okay, so when Plan A fails, Plan B is the right to abortion. This is based on a simple social and economical equality. So you can see that women really are discriminated against because of economics, and they don't have the power to go out and back then go out and support themselves and their family if they so desired. Okay, so fast forwarding to now, studies show that half of the women that seek abortion, half of them live below the poverty line. So you can see where economics comes into this thing. And 3/4 of them that are seeking abortion, they struggle to pay for the basics. We're just talking about food, housing, and transportation. So if 3/4, this is not a small amount of women that are seeking abortion, if they can't pay for these things, let's just say housing, what are they? They're homeless. So you can see how cruel this really is. And so those also that were denied abortions, the study goes on to say that they were 4 times more likely to live below the poverty line, 4 times more likely when you're denying abortion, and they were going downhill. It was declining. Okay, so that being said, we're going to switch gears and look at 6 Supreme Court cases that go along these lines. Okay, so we mentioned already in 1965 Griswold versus Connecticut. And did we answer what that case was? Did somebody mention that, or did I mention that? It's 1965. Let me start here. Can you see this good? Okay. And that's Griswold. Versus Connecticut. And what this is, it gives the legal right to buy and use contraceptive for married couples. And it's a undoing of the Comstock Act or laws. This decision was a 7-2 decision, so it was quite popular at the time, but yet there's 2 dissenters, and I don't know who they were, I didn't look that up, but you can see that people it just wasn't an unanimous thing to let people have use contraceptives. Okay, so I'm going to say what legal. Come on, man. Okay, so it's legal, LEGA now. To use contraceptives. Legal contraceptive. Okay, that's 1965. So 8 years later, we have, everybody knows, Roe v. Wade, and that's in 1973. No, you say that's abortion. Okay, so that doesn't go unchallenged. In 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey is where Roe's challenged. And what happens out of that thing is it's no longer now the law that you have to give your husband permission or ask their permission if you wanted to have an abortion. So that's Planned Parenthood in 1992. And Parenthood versus Casey. C-A-S-E-Y. That's no notice. So you don't have to give them notice. Isn't that a wonderful thing? That's breaking down patriarchy. Probably it made some people really scratch their heads that were in the patriarchal mold, let's just say. And you can see that because this decision was just a squeaker. It was only a 5-4 decision. And fortunately, there was 2 women, Sandra Day O'Connor and RBG, that were there pushing it over. I mean, they had to find at least 2 men that would loosen up on their patriarchy and allow the women to at least not have to pass what they wanted to do with their own bodies, excuse me, by their through their husband's permission. Okay, so now we come to 2003 and we see Lawrence versus Texas. Can anybody tell me what that was about? 2003, Lawrence versus Texas. Who knows? Believe me, I didn't know. I had to go back and review. Okay, well, Lawrence versus Texas is when same-sex was legalized, and it threw down the sodomy laws. And this was through the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment held up the right to privacy and equal protection under the law. So, okay, same sex. Equal. And that was a 6-3 decision, which, you know, seems like we're moving in the right direction here. As far as on the path to all human rights. Okay, so 2015, what's in 2015? Everybody should know this one, right? Anybody want to
Gay marriage?
say again?
Gay marriage?
Yes. And do you know who or what the case was named under?
Bergefell. I know Bergefell.
Yeah. Hodges.
Hodges.
And that was, you're right, gay marriage, the right given. And guess what? How close do you think that one was? I mean, for the Supreme Court's decision. It was also under the 14th Amendment for equal protection under the law. And it was kind of a squeaker also. And it turned out to be a 5-4 decision in 2015, which I didn't really know it was that close, but that one just squeaked by also. And I know that this new Supreme Court would love to have that overturned. They don't seem to have a regard for precedents. Okay, so now we come down to the big black date, 2022, and who knows what that case was. 2022. Dobson versus Jackson's Women Health Organization. And this basically threw down Roe versus Wade, and at the same time, Planned Parenthood versus Casey had to fall with it. And now we see a reverse of the courts because this is really popular. It's a 6-3 decision. The courts have, reversed themselves in a dramatic fashion. Excuse me, I gotta get a drink of water. Okay. So this one here is the bedrock for women's emancipation. And after 50 years, a half a century, it's torn down. So we can see we're going backwards in time. Even though the year says we're going forward, the Supreme Court's forcing us backwards. So how do we get to this point in 2022? Well, the day that Roe was overturned, there's a 24-year-old Latina woman from California, and she says, I'm not a conservative, and I'm happy with the decision, which we would wonder why. This comment is made up, this movement is made up of women, people of color, atheists, LGBTQ+, and Democrats. It's the pro-life movement community. So you can see it's a lot wider than we had heard, that it was more narrow people that were fighting this thing. So at that time, the left wing were reporting that it was old white Christian men that were getting their way, but this is not true. So another woman came to the protest at the Supreme Court and said, I was naive. I came to protest, but saw a celebration. And I have to say, I wasn't so naive what was going to happen. I'm pretty sure that it was going to fall. I mean, I had my fingers crossed, let's say, but it's still, I had the idea that it was just going to fall because of who was in the courts now. So when I saw that there was such a crowd there, cheering for the decision, then I was shocked because I figured, because I grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and feminism was pretty much out there. They were strong and moving forward. So I figured there is going to be an outcry that is going to really shock a lot of people, for people that are going to protest this, but they're not. It was complete opposite. So I was like, I just didn't, in a way, I just didn't hardly believe it, that there wasn't some kind of big protest going on at that time. Anyways, that's just the way things fell. So what really was going on here was that feminism had made a Faustian bargain with celebrity culture. So we can see the culture is playing a big part in this thing. And I forgot what Faustian bargain was. And it's giving up something that you have of great moral or spiritual value for cultural benefit or gain is what it is. So you give up something really important, like feminism, because they fought so hard for it, and then they just kind of went off into more of a symbolic feminism, I would call it. So,
David?
Tessa, yes.
So Faust, literally, Faust sold his soul to the devil. So that's the analogy that they're making, that women sold their soul to the devil, essentially.
Yes, and that's what came to my mind also, because what else can you say when you go backwards like that and it affects so many people, and you're not really got your finger on what is really important, which we're going to talk about here a little bit. That is, the country ended up doing that. Thanks for that, Melissa. So you could see that in today's society, in this generation, and I'm not trying to dog on any generation, but was just a really a weak or complete lack of will that had previously been exhibited in the United States to fight for gender equality. I mean, people were, yeah, they were fighting for it. So we saw what happened was, and she gives this example of Gone with the Wind, romanticizing slavery, which we know they're tied together. When you talk about slavery and emancipation, we've got to talk about women and emancipation. So this romanticized version of Gone with the Wind for slaves is what Hollywood was doing with their romanticizing misogyny. And they're not standing up and fighting it. And there's this thing we're going to talk about later. It's called the Bechdel test, which I didn't know what in the world that was, but I found out. Okay, so another woman comes, and she said she comes up in history. She's Kelsey Hazard, and she formed the organization Secular Pro-Life Organization. So she's pro-life. She says she's an atheist. She's well educated. She's a 29-year-old woman, and she leans liberal on issues like same-sex and climate change. So you think, okay, this woman here is probably going to be, pro-abortion, but no, she's the opposite. And so she says she's dedicated to making abortion unthinkable. So you can see there's people that are outside the box when this is going on. It's not everybody lining up the way you would think it does. When you see a woman that's leaning left and she's trying to make abortion unthinkable. Okay, continue on. The abortion people would have you believe that people like me do not exist. They would have you believe that the pro-life movement is almost exclusively made up of old white men and a few pearl-clutching church women thrown in. This characterization, is insulting to both young and old to think that people were that way. Looking at this, you can talk about old white men, but we realize that the Supreme Court that passed this, threw down Wade, didn't rely on old white men, because you have Justice Kavanaugh. He's not really considered to be old. You have Amy Coney Barrett. She's not a man, obviously. And the other one was, Clarence Thomas. He's not white. So this is not what was being portrayed as just an old Christian white man issue. This is a lot broader, deeper than being portrayed. Okay, so the decision, was it a surprise? Well, it probably was a surprise to a huge amount of people. But if you watch politics and you had been paying attention to Mitch McConnell and the right wing, they're fighting this war. I think there was a frontline done on this. They're fighting this war for like 30 years. That this is something that they just are not going to let go of. And so when Trump gets in there and he basically, in the last moments of his presidency, he ends up getting Amy Coney Barrett in there. They're basically, he had the opportunity to stack the court in the right wing column. And so this really shouldn't have been a surprise, even though it was. So when does the fight really go into high gear? It really gets into high gear in 2014 when the Republicans start to control the Senate, and Mitch McConnell he's basically going to see this thing. This is his opportunity one way or another. And he sees the writing on the wall. If they can just get a president in there to nominate the right person, they're definitely going to block. And, when they block Merrick Garland's case, I mean, there was no comparison. There was months and months that they could have put this, at least had the Senate vote on it, and it was blocked by Mitch McConnell. Whereas the flip side, the contrast of that is Amy Coney Barrett comes in after RBG dies, and they got just a couple of weeks to get this thing on track, and they shove it through. So you can see the hypocrisy, the unfairness, and the downright deceptiveness of the Republican right-wing party in pushing this thing through. Okay, so what happens is in 2014, the Republicans control the U.S. Senate, and they start blocking federal judges, not just the Supreme Court, but they're blocking judges throughout the country because they want to get right-wing judges instead of left-wing judges, and so they have the power to block it, which really doesn't seem fair to me, but this is the way the country is designed, and God allows it, of course. So, what is 2014 for the Nethinims and the world? We all know this one, right? TOE. So 2014 is the time of the end, and we got to remember the two streams of information. And we would see that the media prophets are actually doing their job. They're got it all over the front page, as it used to be in the newspaper's print, but now it's all over the front page of all the internet and everything else, is that democracy is crumbling. And we did a number of, Tess listed a number of ways to see that around the world. And a long time ago, I did one on the, what was the name of it? It was the Umbrella Revolution, showing about how Chinese, the island over there, was their revolution was basically the crumbling of democracy. Okay, so we see it starts crumbling in 2014, not just in our country, but around the world. And one of the main things that is crumbling with that, it's tied right with democracy, is women's rights. And they're going to be a big part of this struggle, and actually be a kind of a casualty you can see in our own country. So in 2014, Time Magazine publishes an article. It's called 2014, This May Have Been the Best Year for Women Since the Dawn of Time. And it starts out with, since the dinosaurs roamed, since pyramids were built, since the locomotive was invented, there has never been a better year for women than 2014. Okay, so this is the article written. And then the author of that article comes back later and says, well, the author says, at that time, I listed reasons that seemed important at the time, but they look really superficial. And see, this is where the war was. We see there's the war over here with the powers, which is the courts and the presidency. And we got another war that's the culture. And culture, it has a great amount of influence, but it doesn't have something that they can pass laws with, right? So the author says, I listed some things that seemed important at the time, but it looked superficial in retrospect. The success of the movie Frozen, which was a skinny, white, empowered woman, a handful of women CEOs, and Beyonce dancing in front of the word feminism and TV awards. Yeah, these were things for culture, but they weren't things that were going to stop what happened in the Dobbs versus decision. Let's see, where was I? Okay, so she goes on to say how feminists were interrogating celebrities, why they call themselves feminists, and what empowered them the most. Excuse me. At the same time, this is all going on. Conservatives are over there amassing raw power to pass trigger laws. And trigger laws are, as soon as Roe goes down, so you know they had their guns pointed on Roe, that they're going to tear it down somehow, one way or another. So as soon as Roe goes down, then these trigger laws were going to trigger the states so that they could go back and put you back 50 years and outlaw, as far as possible, abortions. Okay, so all this is happening, and it's happening at the time that nonprofits are promoting women's empowerment. There's a lot of celebration of women's female inspirational brands, and there's a lot of spending on body positive ad campaigns. So culture is really doing its thing, and these are all basically good, letting people know that you don't have to be in the closet about these things, right? So what's happening also at the same time is there's a lack, or something is not happening, let's just say, and that is that organizations that are fighting to protect reproductive rights, they're not getting any funding or attention. If they do, it's way too little. And you can see that that was the nail in the coffin, that this really wasn't being paid attention to keep fighting for these reproductive rights. Okay, so going on, it says, while the left tallied the number of women nominated for Oscars and which top grossing movies passed the Bechdel test. I mentioned that earlier, and I didn't know what that was, so we'll talk about that. Savvy Republican operatives were carefully building a pipeline of conservative judges with immaculate resumes in anticipation of the future Supreme Court vacancies. So we should all know what the pipeline was and who was the main actor in that. Does anybody want to put a name to that pipeline?
Leonard Leo.
McConnell.
Okay, he's the main actor. And what was the society he was fostering?
Federalist.
Yes, the Federalist. And that turned out to be something that, the Democrats were like turning a blind eye to. They could have had the same thing going on their side, but they weren't paying attention to it in the way they could have been paying attention to it. So that fed these federal judges and it just groomed them for the position that they wanted to get into. I think all the ones that Trump nominated and then were affirmed as Supreme Court justices all went through the Federalist Society. In fact, I heard somewhere, and I think it's true, that one of the ways to get Trump on board with this was they gave him a list and told him basically, these are all Federalist Society people, and these are the ones that should be chosen from. I don't know if he asked for that or they shoved it in on his desk, one of the way, but that's where the whole list came from that he was choosing from. So there was no hope.
I think that was part of the bargain that he made with the evangelicals. Like that's what one there was for them. He told them, give me a list of judges, and they did, and he got their vote.
Okay, thank you for that. I knew that part of the story, but I need your help. Okay, so going back to this Bechdel test, I was like, what is the Bechdel test? Never really heard of it, but it's a test for evaluating works of fiction like films or other works in a way that decides, is this film, portraying sexism or is it characterizing gender stereotyping? So there was this actual test and, it was put out there so that you could rate these movies, and I really thought it was a good thing, but you know, it probably didn't do such a great job, or I'm just out of the loop because I didn't even know about this test. And if they would portray it a little bit more, I think it would educate more people at the least on, you know, what is being brought out there, you know, as far as, because let's face it, movies have an influence that's, I don't think we understand how much influence it has on society and forming it and like steering it, let's just say. Okay, continue on with this quote. The best year I dubbed for women, 2014, the best year I dubbed for women, and also the year that the Republicans won the Senate, putting Mitch McConnell in place to block Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the High Court. But overall, the fall of Wade signifies that liberals were badly outmaneuvered. By focusing on empowerment and losing sight of the nuts and bolts of political mechanisms or political mechanics, they failed to recognize what McConnell and his allies have known all along and had worked so hard for, and that is, only power is power. So she's saying that much of this cultural issues is put on Beyonce and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's the woman that was like inspiring Beyonce. I don't know if she wrote for her, I think she did write for her. And the performances. And it's supposedly because of them, this is one big strength that made 2014 the best year for women culturally, but not in the realm of power. Only power is power. Okay, so what we looked at now is the breakdown of those that are in favor of abortion rights or those who were opposed to it. And 61% were in favor, and 37% were opposed. Okay, this is what the polls were coming out telling us. And why, what's going on here, really? Well, the 61% acted like, these are the liberal ones, acted like that all the gains that were made back in the 60s and 70s, and then when Roe and Wade become law of the land, that everything was secure. But the 37% were acting like what? The personal was political. So they went out and did things politically that backed up their personal beliefs to ram it through the majority. So the minority outdoes the majority. Because the 61%, they liked, let's just say, Beyonce and all the beauty standards that second wave feminism tried to get rid of. They fought against it. So they were basically just interested in what was, you know, the CEOs were doing, which is important, and what was going on and being represented in Hollywood, which, yes, that's important too, but not the nuts and bolts of what was going up. So what happens is the 37% wound up deciding. So what is this? This is a failure for the abolitionists of our day. In Millerite history, the abolitionists would have said in 1844, this is the best year for African Americans since the pyramids, then Christ would have returned. Okay, question. So why is it so hard to emancipate women? Elder Tess spent like weeks on this. And why it's so hard is because sexism is so deeply embedded in culture, which is all of society. That's why it's so hard to emancipate. And then when you see they get gains made, and the patriarchal system, culture, finds a way to backlash on it. Okay, so if 61% said that they believe in segregation, would they get to decide? No, we wouldn't say that. We'd fight them, because why? Segregation is absolutely wrong. Okay, so everybody's surprised when Hillary Clinton loses. Donald Trump, he's still surprising people. And so we could see that in today's abolitionists, they have failed. So if they've failed, what does that mean? That the Sunday law is actually going to be passed. Okay, taking another tack. Ellen White tells us to understand the image of the beast. And to understand it, we need to study the characteristics of the image of the beast. And that would be the characteristics of the papacy. So we're looking at the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, and he meets with the Pope. And he says, we had a great meeting, except for two things: reproductive rights and LGBTQ plus rights. So I'm saying, okay, who is this UN commissioner? He's obviously, he's a sexist, and you can put homophobe in that along with that, and probably a few other things, because he comes out of the meeting saying it's a great meeting, except two major things. Well, guess what? If he's the human rights commissioner, he's not the human men's right commissioner, he's the human rights commissioner, meaning that half of the planet are women, okay? So if half the planet are women, he's not representing half of the people when he says, except for two things. Those things really don't matter that much. I just thought that was appalling. Okay, let's look at Adventism now. Can Adventism see that the United States is speaking like a dragon? Well, apparently not. Can it see the image of the beast? So here's a question. Was the United States, US of A, speaking like a dragon when it overturned Roe versus Wade? Could that fall into the category? What about Texas, when it's basically outlawing anybody to get an abortion, except for the first few days of pregnancy? Are they speaking like a beast? We can see this thing is happening. It's coming on. Iowa, same thing. There's numerous states that are doing all these things, and it's basically just setting it up. Okay, so Elder Tess widens our eyes and says that the images in China and in Pakistan where women are giving themselves abortions, not because it's something to do with Islam, but because if they give birth to another female, they're scared to, because these people, this is a life and death in a lot of these countries. Women are killed all over the place. And what's going on? They're so afraid of patriarchy that if they don't come up with a boy being born, that, their life's in danger. And we can see this is basically all cultural based. It's not Islam. And it is the image of the beast in Pakistan. So for a movement, we stand with women having reproductive rights as a foundational pillar of radical feminism, without which emancipation is impossible. So we're not at the Sunday law now, but we can see it intensifying. And we need to be able to not only see it, but we need to be able to see and sift, like when Time Magazine gets it wrong. Here's a comment from Supreme Court dissent after Roe versus Wade was thrown down along with Casey. It says that Roe versus Wade and Casey recognize, which today's majority does not, is that women's freedom and equality are likewise involved. The majority will allow states to ban abortion from conception onward because it does not think forced childbirth at all implicates a woman's right to equality and freedom. Today's courts, that is, do not think that there is anything in that is of constitutional significance attached to a woman's control of her body and the path of her life. In some sense, that's the difference in the nutshell between our precedents, which was torn down, and the majority opinion. Very startling. Someone would say, I support women's rights, so I must have passed the test, right? Well, many of us in the left-wing stream did not see it coming. And why is that? Is because how lightly gender equality was taken. They failed to be abolitionists. Well, the failure is not standing on the platform of radical feminism. What's the failure? It's not standing on the platform of radical feminism. Okay, so in review, be closing here, is we talked about a little history and who was the mother of basically the pill. Also the founders of Planned Parenthood, criminalized laws against contraception and even among married couples. And then we listed 5 Supreme Court cases. 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut, legalizing contraception for married couples. 1973, Roe v. Wade, legalizing abortion up to viability. 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The women no longer had to give notice to their husbands whether they wanted to have an abortion. 2003, Lawrence versus Texas, same-sex legalized under the 14th Amendment. 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, gay marriage given the right. And then it's all torn down in 2022 with Dobson versus Women's Health, Jackson Women's Health Organization. So women's emancipation was set back 50 years, ending the progress. It was erased. Okay, so we also looked at the right wing and how it's so tied to culture, showing it's not an old white man's problem or solution. It's more of a cultural thing. And we saw that the fault is what? Of the 61% of the people polled that did not what? They did not say that the personal is political, and then 37% actually acted on it and lived it. So they forced it down through the voting for the president and voting for all those people in the Senate that would force it through. And then we see once they get there, then the Supreme Court makes the decision. It was probably a no-brainer for all of them. I don't think they were sweating over that one. They were just going to do what they were going to do. So what's needed from radical feminism is the 2 principles that we started out with. Sexism is the deepest, the worst, the oldest foundational form of discrimination, and the personal is political. So it's up to us individually to live out these things, to be on the side of heaven. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes my talk presentation. Any questions? Any comments?
That was great, David. Thank you. So I'm really struck with how caged women still are. I mean, how it's, I don't know, we just get caught up in daily life, or I'm going to speak for myself, getting caught up in just living and not seeing how everything has been affecting women all along, and how we really can't achieve equality without it being indemnified by law.
Yes,
right?
it's so true. And we're supposed to be one of the
Thank-
freest nations, but we're going backwards. So you know what also struck me, it wasn't in this study, but I heard it. I don't know if it's elder test, but it should have been, and probably a whole lot of other people, is that yes, a lot of this is on, let's just say, the backs of women, because we can see it started with women here, but really the men need to join into this. And I know that I haven't joined in as strongly as I should have in many instances, but it can't be just women. This fight is more than about that. And indeed, for us men, we need to stand by these personal as political, and not just be complacent or silent. And it convicted me of doing more in this direction. Self-compassion. Any other questions or comments?
I thank you for your self-confession, and I hope it inspires other men to do the same.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. A very good job. You did very well.
Well, praise the Lord. It's all the information that is in our movement and needs to be, as Peter said, repeated and reminded.
Thank you, David.
Thank you,
You're
David.
welcome. You're welcome.
Inspiring me to come out of my shell or whatever it is and speak up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's never too late.
Reminds me of Ryan Gosling. I think his name's Ryan Gosling, something like that, speaking up about the snubbing of the women who produced the Barbie movie when they didn't get recognized.
Yeah. I didn't really get into that much, but I thought that was just a raw deal.
Yes. And I learned a little bit about the Barbie movie and about how, the premise and all that kind of stuff. And from what I gathered, the reason the Ken wanted to have the Kendom was because he felt like Barbie was overshadowing him. But what he really wanted was not to be overpower him, but in the end, he just wanted to be equal. And that's what Barbie was able, at the end, that's, I think, what the message was. We just want to be equal. We don't want to be one gender dominates another.
Okay. Well,
I
thank you.
thought he wore a sweatshirt. I mean, not a sweatshirt, but a t-shirt that said, "I am Kenough." Meaning, he's enough by himself. He doesn't have to think that he's just part of the Barbie world. He's enough. Kenoughh.
Oh, I get it. Okay. I haven't watched the movie, but it was on the airplane when we were coming back from Texas, and I couldn't hear the sound, but I could see it, and I just hadn't got it figured out until I heard, certain people were like really down on this. I'm like, well, why are they so down on this movie? And it was because basically patriarchy was getting a black eye or something. I should take the time maybe to watch it to see what the whole thing was all about, but I just hadn't put the effort into that.
Hey, David,
Yes.
I just wanted to add, you talk about a confession. We have to realize, where things are and how things got the way they are. And I understand just as when someone is born into this world, you don't know when you're born individually, you don't know whether you're male or whether you're female. You find that out when you're born. Okay. Yeah. And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is the confession. Yes, men need to confess their part in all of this stuff and not recognizing how to stand up for women's rights. But since barely more than half the people on the planet are female, I also recognize that, and it's the saddest thing to me, is how many women, as you pointed out in the beginning of your presentation, are so beat down and can't deal with the repercussions of the patriarchy. They're willing to submit to the patriarchy, and that just exemplifies it. So, and I feel really bad about that, because so many women don't even have a good perspective on it either. And so we all have to wake up, and I really, really appreciate this review. It brought something that Elder Tess originally put out that really needs to be, on the forefront of our minds from this point forward, for sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, that reminded me of that startling statement in the beginning about sifting, and this is like kind of the backbone of how to sift. Yeah. Anyways.
So I want to make sure that Mary's comment is highlighted because it's very important, and it contradicts my statement, and I'm glad that she's corrected my statement of that it only can happen, equality can only happen through law. So what she's saying, and Mary, I hope it's okay that I'm reading this. As with slavery, sexism cannot be abolished by a law alone. It requires both personal and political. Otherwise, it only morphs into something else, just as slavery morphed into racism. The sin is in the heart, a mindset.
Yeah.
So, of course, before it becomes law, it has to be within our hearts. We have to do the work. We have to practice what we profess.
Yep. And it really is a change of heart. I mean, when we went from, I'll say myself, when I went from conservative to liberal, and then we learned from Farminder that, we're still conservative. Well, anyways, yeah, I think you know what I'm saying. The sexism part was still right along with it. It took me a while to get that going too. So this is really a very deep, as we know, thing that's in society, and we've all been, like the way Bob puts it, been marinating it all of our lives. And it's just a major battle that, by the grace of God, we'll never get rid of it unless God helps us. And like some others have said, we may need 1,000 years to get a few things washed out of us also. I appreciate your comments, and for reading that one. I wasn't paying attention to any of that in the chat. So was that the only thing that was noteworthy? Okay, so there's
David,
yes.
just one more thought. It's a stark reminder. Also, another point you brought out, whether it was deliberate or inadvertently, is that it's always a minority who seems to be controlling the majority, and that's not democracy, in its largest sense. And so it just shows that the whole system, because the way it's set up, there's issues there that cause it to be manipulated, and we see that the minority is always controlling the majority, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, it is a big problem. Thank you for adding that in. And Troy puts a yes to that. All right, if there's no other comments, I'll close this in prayer. Okay, let's bow. Dear God in heaven, we thank you so much, Lord, for opening our eyes. You give us opportunities each day to stand up for you, Lord. And we pray by your strength that we will be able to rightly represent you, Lord, and not miss opportunities. We thank you for the Sabbath and the rest. We thank you for our dear elder who presented this. And we know it's straight from heaven, Lord. So help us to be heavenly thinkers, believers, and doers. And we pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.